it looks like we might actually be moving forward and getting the stream going. All right. I hope everyone on Discord can hear me okay. Let me know if you can't, by the way. Oh no, happy to. This is the fun times, right? This is the fun shit. It's life is mostly work these days for me again. Thank God. It was not for a while. So it's kind of nice to be able to do this once in a while and sort of dive myself back into some stuff I really care about with some people who are very much surprising and wonderful to me every week. Love you all that fun shit. All right, let's we'll go ahead and see what we can do here. 1 second, I need to make sure that this stupid thing is picking up all the things I want it to. Let's see, we'll go here. All right. If you could just one more time for me, someone say hello, just real quick. Yeah, see, a stupid thing is not working for me. This is frustrating. Let's see. Hope you see. We want monitor. Okay. Why can I not hear shit? I know no one heard anything. I know. I'm trying to make sure everyone gets on the recording because we had this nightmare last time that was just super frustrating to me because a handful of the questions at the end that are my favorite things didn't make it, which sucks. So one more time, someone give me a hello. Sorry. Still not fucking doing it. Amazing. What a piece of shit fucking everything is on Windows. It's the worst. All right. Well, I know. It's the way it works. Let's get that working and then go here and pop it over. Okay, now try. Let's give it a shot. One last shot. Yes.
Absolutely.
There we go. We're working. We're finally getting things moving. Isn't that exciting?
Excellent.
So everyone's aware, we do have recordings happening. So if you do not want to be on a recording, that's fine, but don't talk. Because we are streaming to YouTube because there is some value in theory of people being able to listen to us ramble and me ramble about all this shit. We are continuing this week after 2 weeks of what was family and work and travel and all kinds of shit. Man, Vegas is not fun. But back to the main section of the book, as far as I think we're concerned at this point. It's one of the things I really enjoy is we have JK who joins us every week. And I think for the last 4 or 5 months, JK has asked, so when are we getting to Oedipus? And I've been promising that it will get to Oedipus at last at some point, and we're there. So it's been a build up. But I'm very glad to finally be hitting it and going over it. I see some new faces. It's lovely to have you. How the readings go every week is simple. We literally do a close reading of Anti-Oedipus. I'm probably going to dive back a little bit and actually just start the section over because 2 weeks off, fuzziness, it's worth going back over and sort of having that conversation. So as we go, don't hesitate to type in chat. Don't hesitate to ask questions. We'll read each paragraph, discuss, go over anything that anyone wants us to, and we'll see what ends up happening. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and just kick us the fuck off, and we're just going to get this going, I think. Unless anyone has any upfront questions, upfront notes, or things they want to go over first. And yes, Eric, Vegas is, as far as I can tell, the most depressing city ever. Vegas is fascinating. 20 years ago, I simply would agree with you. The way that the sort of surrounding area around the main strip has shifted and changed is really fascinating because after COVID, thanks to COVID, because everything died in the tourism industry, a lot of restaurants, top tier hotels, laid off incredibly talented people who all kind of started getting these government loans and a little bit of subsidies locally and things to open up what are some of the most extraordinary hole in the wall foods I've ever had. So, yeah. It is depressing, but it was kind of I met some really cool people. So yeah, who knows? Jake asks, does this explain Trump's return to power? We can go over that. The answer is yes. The answer is yes. We start getting into not just Trump's return to power, but also the way power functions within our space. It's not just Trump. This is not the old leftist claptrap of, oh, there's no difference between the two parties. This is, hey, by the way, in capital, the way power is structured is within this style, how it is formed, how it is put together. So there's a little bit different than those things. So we will make our way through and see what we can do. But I'll go ahead and start, share my screen in Discord, and we can continue from there. All right, starting over it. Section 3.11, Oedipus at last. In the territorial, or even the despotic machine, social economic reproduction is never independent of human reproduction, of the social form of this reproduction. The family is therefore an open praxis, a strategy that is coextensive with the social field. The relations of filiation and alliance are determinate, rather determined as dominant. As a matter of fact, what is marked or inscribed on the socius directly is the producers or non-producers according to the standing of their family or their standing inside the family. The reproduction process is not directly economic, but passes by way of the non-economic factors of kinship. This is true not only with respect to the territorial machine and to local groups that determine the place of each member in social economic reproduction, according to one's status from the standpoint of the alliances and filiations, but also with respect to the despotic machine, which adds the relations of the new alliance and direct filiation to the old alliance and filiations, whence the role of the sovereign's family in despotic overcoding, that of the dynasty, whatever its mutations, its indecisions, which are inscribed under the same category of new alliance. The process, by no means, remains the same in the capitalist system. Representation no longer relates to a distinct object, but to productive activity itself. The socius as full body has become directly economic as capital money. It does not tolerate any other preconditions. What is inscribed or marked is no longer the producers or non-producers, but the forces and means of production as abstract quantities that become effectively concrete in their becoming related or their conjunction. Labor capacity or capital, constant capital or variable capital, capital of filiation or capital of alliance. Capital has taken upon itself the relations of alliance and filiation. There ensues a privatization of the family, according to which the family ceases to give its social form to economic reproduction. It is as though disinvested, placed outside the field. In the language of Aristotle, the family is now simply the form of human matter or material that finds itself subordinated to the autonomous social form of economic reproduction, and that comes to take the place assigned it by the latter. That is to say, that the elements of production and anti-production are not reproduced in the same way as humans themselves, but find in them a simple material that the form of economic reproduction pre-organizes in a mode that is entirely distinct from the form this material has as human reproduction. Precisely because it is privatized, placed outside the field, the form of the material or the form of human reproduction begets people whom one can readily assume to be all equal in relation to one another. But inside the field itself, the form of social economic reproduction has already preformed the form of the material so as to engender, there where they are needed, the capitalist as a function derived from capital, the worker as a function derived from labor capacity, etc. In such a way, the family finds itself countersected by the order of classes. In this sense, indeed, segregation is the only origin of equality. It's a lot at once, isn't it? It's just a huge amount at once. We'll go through actually piece by piece of this because it's super important. The top line here, we have come to capital. This is the last bit of savages, barbarians, and civilized men, the three movements of the socius as it's sort of described through it. The first is the territorial, the earth socius, then the despotic, then capital. As they say, in the territorial or even the despotic machine, social economic reproduction is never independent of human reproduction, of the social form of this reproduction. They mean this pretty much literally and bareface. The way that the world operates, the economic systems are dependent on who's fucking whom, who's making kids with whom, and who's family and related to whom, across the board. This is, in the earliest forms of this, it is the way that alliances are formed through marriage and through progeny, that we find more labor that can do work. It's the social world that exists is dependent on the family. It is dependent on, maybe not the family directly, but the idea of reproduction in the human world. How many kids you have, can you have kids? Reproduction as a thing is where it is centered. In the despotic, that of kings, very much the same. Obviously, you having children in some sense as a peasant, but when you're talking about the nature of handing things down from king to prince who becomes king, or queen to princess who becomes queen, the nature of dynasties, the way that these things operate, the way that relationships happen, and the way human production works, by nature, this is how these things, how the social world is sort of built. Human reproduction is just part of all of this. As they say, the family is an open praxis, a strategy coextensive with the social field. How your family is sorted, who can marry who, how they get married, how they have kids, who has kids, how many kids, all of these things. It becomes itself a strategy coextensive with the social field because the reproduction is so important. The relations of filiation and alliance are determinate, or as they say, determined as dominant. As a matter of fact, what is marked or inscribed on the socius is the producers or non-producers according to the standing of their family or their standing inside. If you go look at ways that sort of ethnological studies have been done, from Strauss to Griol to Godelier, you'll see that they talk about pluses and minuses, the positive or negatives. Sort of think of it as if today is the easiest way to think of it, as like a point system from a video game almost, where if you have a daughter, that's a good because you can secure that, and that can become a place where a man from another family attaches, you can marry her off. A son, less so. Someone who's unable to reproduce, for example, it becomes a different setup, a different thing. They're non-producers according to the standing of their family or their standing inside of it. Middle children, firstborns, these kinds of things that have become tropes inside of, say, common writing or the stories of old, all the way back to, Shakespeare, and then even before then, would maybe the Epic of Gilgamesh even. You start seeing this idea of the firstborn son, the oldest daughter, the youngest daughter, the whatever it may be. This setup is the thing. The reproduction process is not directly economic, but passes by way of the non-economic factors of kinship. This is true not only with respect to the territorial machine, to the local groups that determine the place of each member in social economic reproduction. This is the way that in the territorial machine, inside of the tribal, the prehistorical, local groups determine the place of each member in social economic reproduction. What gets made where, who does what, there's a placement that's a little bit, that is really the family is just part of, as if they were displaced across all of it. According to one's status from the standpoint of alliances and filiations, but also with respect to the despotic machine. And again, this is adds the relations of new alliance, direct filiation to old, marriage between kingdoms may result in a brand new kingdom that is just bringing them together. This is actually how a lot of modern nation states sort of came about. The marriage of families, the keeping of peace through this, the nature of the dynasty. These are inscribed under the same category of new alliance. Now, the capitalist system changes this. It changes it drastically. Aside from all the ways that we've talked about in this section, Right now, they're referring specifically to how the family interacts with this, what the family means to social reproduction. The family wasn't a separate category, really. Your family was your relatives. The idea of brother and sister in prehistorical tribes didn't just denote nuclear family. You would have brothers who were fifth cousins, who maybe you grew up with. You still see this a little bit in some communities today, much less so, much less so. But in capital, this has all changed. Here's why. Representation, as it says here, a representation no longer relates to a distant object, but to productive activity itself. The socius as full body has become directly economic as capital money. It does not tolerate other preconditions. The socius had preconditions of existence, preconditions of behavior, preconditions of things inside of the despotic, inside of everything else. There was production that needed to happen to enable it as such. This is the way that the earth was considered, the way that they talked about also the despotic. But capital somehow comes before this. It doesn't allow other things to be valued before capital. It becomes the system of value itself. What is inscribed or marked is no longer producers or non-producers, pluses or minuses, women or men, how fertile you are, whatever it may be, but the forces and means of production as abstract quantities that become effectively concrete in their becoming related or their conjunction. There's a lot said here. Think of it how money is valued, like, or stock, or, I mean, anything. There's an old joke that stock is only ever worth two values. The day you buy it and the day you sell it. This is accurate. The value you buy a thing at and the value you sell a thing at are actually the only ones that matter to the stock that you owned specifically. It may go up and down in value during that, but it doesn't become valuable. It doesn't become the actual value until someone buys or sells it. That's what the other prices were. Someone else buying it high, someone else buying it low, decreasing, increasing the value of the stock. This is the setup that happens that allows value to become concrete. This is what enables capital and why capital needs, for example, a single dollar, a single point in order to sort of gather around, the world using the dollar, everyone else trying to do something else, but ultimately coming back to the dollar. For now, who knows? We've got a lot coming. But this thing is a bit different. Instead of being very contingently built, it does come back to this value that is sort of produced in this thing, the forces and means of production as abstract quantities that become concrete in their becoming related or their conjunction, the conjunction of everything coming together in that moment and then moving on, that this concretization. And they give a handful of examples that I think are in line with what I just said. There's labor capacity or capital. These things become concrete in their conjunction. Constant capital or variable capital. Go read Marx. Capital of filiation or capital of alliance. These things, as they say, capital has taken upon itself the relations of alliance and filiation. There ensues a privatization of the family, according to which the family ceases to give its social form to economic reproduction. Where once the family was everything, including in the world of kings, in the world of Caesars, in the world of anyone who was in charge, or businesses were fathers being handed to sons. I've got a son who can also become a shoemaker. I've got a son who will take over the farm. The family, the reproductive capacity was part and parcel of these things. But that doesn't happen anymore. People don't take over their dad's businesses. Not really. It's a really outward choice for someone to do it, but it's not built in. There isn't a direct thing that's happening inside of an economic reproduction that is taking from the family its social form. The family instead is disinvested, placed outside the field. As Aristotle might say, the family is simply the form of human matter or material that finds itself subordinated to the autonomous social form of economic reproduction, and that comes to take the place assigned it by the latter. The family no longer part and parcel of the social world in an active praxis in the social world, not what it's for, not how it works, not what it does. Instead, the way that these things then sort of rebound on us now is the family is placed outside of the social space. And instead of being part and parcel and sort of having internal family sort of dynamics determined socially, it's a little bit different now. As they say, it comes to take the place assigned it by economic reproduction. This is to say, the elements of production and anti-production are not reproduced in the same way as humans themselves, but find in them a simple material that the form of economic reproduction pre-organizes in a mode that is entirely distinct from the form this material has as human reproduction. They're going to explain this later. I hate saying that. I always feel like a dick when I say that. We'll get to this in like the next paragraph, actually, because I think it's a 2-page paragraph, maybe 3. But be thinking about how human reproduction operates socially and how it doesn't really determine things socially. And instead now we have social reproduction determining our own reproduction. Idiocracy is actually a phenomenal example of this. It opens with this sort of eugenicist take on why certain people are producing more than others. But the thing that's really important to it is it's trying to make light of, or bring to light, kind of this same point. It's doing it in an awkward kind of fetishistic way, in my opinion. But underneath it, why do people have kids? This isn't a socially determined thing anymore. Instead, it's haphazard or chosen. It is as if we are determining it ourselves. We don't determine anything ourselves, but I am choosing whether or not I'm having a child, or I am ridiculous and uncouth and low class, and I'm going to fuck women, and I'm going to have lots and lots of babies, and they're going to turn out dumb. This opening is tarrying with this problem, because reproduction is no longer what it was 200, 300, 400 years ago, where you had children to take on the family business, where you had children to marry other families, to create bonds between landowners or between anyone. These things were shattered over the last few hundred years. This shift changes why we reproduce. It's no longer coextensive with the social field, precisely because it is privatized, placed outside the field. The form of the material or the form of human reproduction begets people whom one can readily assume to be all equal in relation to one another, as the liberal conception of everyone, egalitarianism, all of that. Everyone's equal. We don't have a family who's this. Everyone in the family we love equally. We don't have a firstborn who gets everything. We don't have this. It's everyone's equal in relation to one another. But inside the field itself, the form of social economic reproduction has already preformed the form of the material so as to engender there where they are needed. The capitalist as a function derived from capital, the worker as functions derived from labor capacity. In such a way, the family finds itself countersected by the order of classes. In this sense, indeed, segregation is the only origin of equality. Great line. We'll go over that another time, but it's a fantastic line I really, really like. So we're opening up here, and then I'll open it up to questions just to make sure we get to it. But we open up here with kind of the big thing. Hey, we're finally at Oedipus. We've made our way through all 3 socii. We're in capital. And finally, we're at how the family figures into this, because the family has been part and parcel of everything. But in this new space where capital is actually the center of it all, where the codes of old are completely being broken down, and we're having these odd new axiomatized elements. The codes of old were developed socially, and so were families. All of these things sort of came together, and now we have all these after images that we've kind of axiomatized. But how do these after images come to be? Why do these after images come to be? And this is where we're finally talking about Oedipus at last. And of course, given the book's title, it's kind of an important distinction. There you go. A long rambly Brooks today, I guess. I did a lot of prep for this because I want to make sure we nail it. But please, does anyone have questions on this? I promise I will only once or twice say it's coming up soon because a lot of it is. We're only in the first paragraph. And this, just to sort of skip to the next, you can see the next page is this fucking master of just one paragraph is the next page, and then it's a page and a half for the next paragraph. So we've got big bits coming, to say the least. Big, giant bits coming. But I'm opening it up. Questions, thoughts, anything, please, anyone.
I have a comment.
Please. Go for it, DeBlow.
Obviously, they are using filiation very specifically with intention. But I couldn't help but think of the consequences of saying capital, as in to say the capital of a country or a nation or a state is a particular city, a head city, right? Where all the other cities are maybe provincial capitals, or they are the sons who do not inherit directly, right? So in this kind of model of seeing of seeing children who are multitudinous in assembly, there is a capital. There is one who is made special or unique in some manner.
I think, I mean, specifically to that, I think one of the things they're going to be getting at is how capital, the capital with an A, the money currency type, is continually breaking down such things. So we don't actually have capitals, not in that sense, not in the way that it matters in the sort of old coded sense, but instead an axiomatized version that denotes the particularities of why things are where they're at, in that sense of things, versus of old, where it was we'd honor the capital because the capital is where our nation was birthed, or where this person died, or whatever it may be that sort of mattered particularly. This becomes less and less important as we continue to move further into capitalism, because ultimately, again, capital doesn't really have a capital, a location, a central spot. It has a general centralized area. It happens to be American hegemony for the time being. But within this space, they're very happy to have excessive pockets of poverty, for example, that make the capital less than the most important place and more just the happenstance center as it continues to move, if that makes sense. There's a great, Sybertine Blanc wrote a great book, Marx and State, which takes the idea of, it actually has, I think, a chapter on this, which I thought you were referencing, but I think you may not have read it, and you should, because I think you dig it. But it talks about specifically the formation of the state, how it operates from a very sort of diagrammatic standpoint, and I think you get a kick out of it, given what you just said. Just as a thought, it's really good. It's good shit. We've got it also up here somewhere in the server.
Just a thought that was instigated by DeBlow's point, which reminded me I'd been seeing this reconstruction by a different name of central planning with all the private equity that's happening, and this, reconstitution of disparate factors into something that can be controlled by, a sort of board of directors, and in these weird pockets. And Dublo reminded me of that with the consideration of this centering all the mechanistics around a particular center of production, and how it can sort of reify or reconstitute these dynamics under a different, I guess you might call it I guess a different ideology. The Lacanian would be like the different symbolic order, but just a very interesting thought, and I'm glad that Dublo brought that up and that you bounced off it, Brooks. This is great.
Yeah. No, it's super fun. It's also in here on that note. One of the things when they talk about how these things are formatted, we talk about in as you mentioned, the boards, for example, boards, CEOs, this corporate structures and things like that. We can actually see, and this is again what we're getting at in this section specifically. When we talk about how the family is formed and the setup, there is, in theory, this idea that everyone in the family is equal. But what's happening in the family, instead of it being socially determined, where the family coexists socially and the family is basically a form of praxis socially. Now these odd places and odd things cut through the family. So you have the capitalist and the labor capacity. You have these things that are how families become organized within themselves. If you ever have kids, you'll see this very, very clearly about how you start dividing labor and how these things become what they do. It's fucking really weird, and there's only so much you can do to sort of counteract it once you've begun and you start to notice it. But that's the thing they're driving at here, is it says they form just inside the field itself, the form of social economic reproduction has already preformed the form of the material so as to engender there where they are needed, the capitalist as a function derived from capital and the worker as a function derived from labor capacity, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That the quantification, the elements within capitalism and the social field that are that exist, the things that exist in these quantified forms, there's a function derived from it that sort of gets placed or built inside of the family with this sort of malleable human matter, as they're sort of talking about it. And that's what we're going to be getting into, because it's really this odd thing where they say, as they say, in such a way, the family finds itself countersected by the order of classes. The order of classes that exist socially, the family becomes countersected rather than being coextensive. And there's a big difference there. It's actually a fucking huge, huge difference.
And it's coming across. It's well received. You're doing a great job.
Okay, yay! This is not fun. JK, I know every time. Trust me, I'm always going to leave an option open. JK, what do you got? What do you got for me? I know you're going to ask something.
Yeah, I was going to ask you if you could elaborate on the notion of alliance and filiation, and how that process, works under capital. That the capital takes over that process of who intermarries, who intermarries who, and so forth, and how their kids are going to be reproduced.
Yeah. So this is where it gets odd. So we have to think of the placement of filiative and alliances. Think of them as an intersection between these two forces, is how you find yourself, or how a subject or a unique individual or organism finds itself placed in society. Now, let's talk about how this forms and how this comes to be. In the prehistoric times, we have the Earth Socius. And in the Earth Socius, you have your alliances, which are people you work with, that you've got kind of you could say social contracts in that style of thing. But it's like families that also exist near you, and you have to survive, so you work with them. How do you form alliances? Well, you do this by marrying, generally speaking, by having humans in common. If my grandson and your grandson are the same person, we're pushed towards working together. So we need that sort of odd alliant nature. Well, how do we have people to marry? Well, we do that by creating more people. Through this odd germinative process, I make girls and boys with my wife, you make girls and boys with your wife, and out come all these people, and we marry them together. So the filiative, my direct descendant line, from dad to son or mom to daughter, whatever it may be, the family line is one. The alliant line is that sort of horizontal. And you can actually see this the way family trees have been done, I think, fucking forever, where they have like all the families, and then they have like your filiative line you can trace upwards like a tree. This is not far from how it's been done for a very, very long time. But this odd thing happens because this is purely socially managed and socially coextensive within the Earth Socius. And this is not reifying this. This is not saying that we should go back to it. It's just saying this is kind of how we start when we're in groups. In these, again, go read Grial, go read, some of my favorites, but Godelier, the Metamorphosis of Kinship. God damn it, is that what it's called? I don't have my glasses on. Metamorphosis of Kinship, I'm pretty sure, is the full title. But Godelier really goes into how kinship rights and rules formed this. But then along came despots. And they use despot here particularly because it's really talking about someone who's there, or not even someone, some thing, some form, whatever it is. It could be a group. It could be like fucking brilliant, fucking statue. It doesn't really matter, but something that claims to be father to all. And that kingship, that godly ordinance of our lineage. I owe my lineage to him in every way. My filiative line traces back to beneath his, but to his in some capacity. He traces his line back to the first person of our tribe. He is the one. But all of our lineage now goes through him. But also our alliances. If I marry my daughter to another tribe, that doesn't mean fucking anything. But if a king marries the queen of another state, this changes things. And that setup means that all of my alliance is through them as well, which puts us in a really weird place because the queen mom, who's my mom, is sort of doing a lot of really weird shit by sort of fucking by the king dad, but he's not the dad. He's her dad too. It's weird. That is weird shit. And people do weird shit. And this weird thing that is in itself deeply incestuous, as we've kind of learned over the years, this odd interaction of the filiative and the alliant, this goes through the king or queen or blah, blah, blah. Doesn't matter. That godhead despot. Capital comes about with a bit of a switch. Instead of being in the despot, that filiative and alliant is now kind of dispersed amongst capital. Everything that is done, everything that is recreated, everything that is produced, all the alliances are made. You buy them with cash. You afford them with cash. Cash makes cash. If you keep it in a savings bank, you will have more money. Fucking how? Well, magic, but whatever. Like, there's this really weird thing that happens where now everything is through capital. And as soon as that happens, not only are we no longer really caring about the family as coextensive, because now even the king's family doesn't matter. We may have some level of dynasties like the Bushes or the Clintons, or God forbid, the Obamas or the Trumps. We have some semblance of that in the despotic, but in capital, it matters less. It matters a lot less, and it matters less all the time because it's in capital that we find ourselves pulled. It's through capital that we find the filiative and the alliant brought back. And this is the change that we're talking about, because now the family no longer is coextensive, whether it's coextensive with who my family actually marries, and that affects the social world, or whether it's coextensive with the king marrying the queen of Persia or whatever the fuck else. Now, here I am, and I kind of can marry anyone I want, in theory, and anyone can marry me, and great. But what determines my place socially? Well, it's how much cash I have. It's how much cash I have. It's my class. Am I labor? Am I a capitalist? Like that thing determines my place, which means the filiative and the alliant are through cash. They're through capital. And that change of all of this pushes us into a new way of having to understand our own placement. But even more so, it changes how the family relates socially. No longer public or coextensive with the social field, now private. And this is where we kind of continue the next little bit. Because that's the big deal here, is talking about the Oedipal, because we're finally at Oedipus, and that's the big deal, because we haven't been there. There's been all the pieces of Oedipus, but not quite Oedipus yet. But now we're there. So the next paragraph I kind of want to jump to, unless anyone has a thing, I think it might be perfect for us to write in, unless anyone's got something for me. All right. This placing of the family outside the social field is also its greatest social fortune, for it is the condition under which the entire social field can be applied to the family. Individual persons are social persons, first of all, i.e. functions derived from abstract quantities. They become concrete in the becoming related or the axiomatic of these quantities in their conjunction. They are nothing more nor less than configurations or images produced by the point signs, the breaks flux, the pure figures of capitalism. The capitalist as personified capital, i.e., as a function derived from the flux of capital, and the worker as personified labor capacity, i.e., a function derived from the flux of labor. In this way, capitalism fills its entire immanence with images. Even destitution, despair, revolt, and on the other side, the violence and the oppression of capital become images of destitution, despair, and revolt, violence, or oppression. But starting from non-figurative figures, or from the breaks flux that produce them, these images will themselves be capable of figuring and reproducing only by shaping a human material whose specific form or reproduction falls outside the social field that nonetheless determines this form. Private persons are therefore images of the second order, images of images, that is, simulacra, that are thus endowed with an aptitude for representing the first order images of social persons. These private persons are formally delimited in the locus of the restricted family as father, mother, child. But instead of being a strategy that, through the action of alliances and filiations, opens onto the entire social field, is coextensive with it, and countersects its coordinates, it would appear that the family is now merely a simple tactic around which the social field recloses, to which it applies its autonomous requirements of reproduction, and that it counteracts with all its dimensions. The alliances and filiations no longer pass through people, but through money. So the family becomes a microcosm, suited to expressing what it no longer dominates. In a certain sense, the situation has not changed, for what is invested through the family is still the economic, political, and cultural social field, its breaks and flux. Private persons are an illusion, images of images, or derivatives of derivatives. But in another sense, everything has changed, because the family, instead of constituting and developing the dominant factors of social reproduction, is content to apply and envelop these factors in its own mode of reproduction. Father, mother, and child thus become the simulacrum of the images of capital, Mr. Capital and Madam Earth and their child, the worker, with the result that these images are no longer recognized at all in the desire that is determined to invest only their simulacrum. The familial determinations become the application of the social axiomatic. The last thing is kind of the big deal there. There's a lot here, actually, but that last note. So we'll make our way to it and make sure we go through it. There is so much said here. To go back, and I know I'm going to be broken record a bit until we kind of get through maybe this section, because it's the big thing to harp on. The families, the way families were structured, how we related to each other through the filiative and through the alliant in the earth, and even the despotic. This relationship set out the social field. Even though the earth or the despot may claim credit for it, and we may give credit for it, the families and how we reproduced, the social pressures of that were so deep and so extreme that it actually is what determined the way that the social world functioned. The family mattered greatly to that. It doesn't anymore. It just doesn't. That's done. Where once we needed a bunch of people in order to just survive and have enough farm, or we needed to have marriages in order to have, peace or prosperity or whatever it may be, or have children that can continue a dynasty in order to have the story continue to be told, whatever it may be. It's over. Capital doesn't give a shit about any of those things. Capital breaks them apart. Capital shatters those codes. And it is now the thing that kind of determines all this. The family no longer determines the social space. The social space now determines the shape of the family itself. The family determinations become the application of the social axiomatic. This is that thing they keep coming back to. It's this odd rearrangement of all of the elements that are going on. As they start out, and we'll skip the beginning first bit. Individual persons are social persons first of all. They are functions derived from abstract quantities. They become concrete in the becoming related, or the axiomatic of these quantities, in their conjunction. This is how we've all kind of come to be. We are social first. We are determined socially. We are not an individual that is first gets a soul given to us by God, or that grows an internal soul thanks to mommy and daddy, and the social world doesn't even matter. But mom and dad are not really in the social world. It's just a cute little enclosed family. No, we are determined socially, and we become concretized. We find our actualities in the becoming related, or the axiomatic of abstract quantities colliding, and the conjunction of them that determines us. Those things determine us through this. These individual people are nothing more or less than configurations or images produced by point signs, produced by Brake's flux. The way we've been talking about images, and we spent a lot of time on this earlier, this is not an image in the sense of taking in an entire image. This is not what they're talking about. This is not how it works. We have a really weird system that's sort of building a particular process that images go through of decoding and then axiomatizing. And the smallest bits of things are their quantification. The way that you're listening to me right now is through bits, through a machine. You might be looking at me through pixels. None of the pixels, none of the bits have any fucking meaning themselves whatsoever. They just do not. But altogether, you're stringing it through. I'm helping you string it through. We're building this through the images that are being placed in front of you. This is not seeing a picture. Oh, it's a painting of a capitalist. That's what I'm saying. This is not what they mean by images. Just to sort of paint the shit out of that. This is not the point. Instead, they're talking about, as they say, the pure figures of capitalism. Figures being operant here, because we're going to start getting into the paralogisms of the connective syntheses really, really fast here. So be ready for that shit. They start the capitalist as personified capital, as a function derived from the flux of capital. Personified capital is a really fascinating thing to consider. It doesn't just mean guy who has lots of money. That's not it. The capitalist as personified capital is, they are sort of the rate of change and the derivative nature of capitalism means that the dollar doesn't really have the dollar's value. The dollar's value changes based on how often it's used and what it's used on at any given point. That value inflates or deflates based on a ton of market forces and a ton of things that are sort of interplaying. The capitalist isn't just becoming a fat guy or a skinny guy based on this. He isn't just $1 billion. It's not how $1 billion works. $1 billion is the derivative of all of those elements, the derivative of that $1 billion, the rate of change in it. Someone sitting on old money is very, very different than someone who, like Elon Musk, for example, it does not sit on old money and instead has billions in literally sort of ephemeral capital that is loans taken out against potential future earnings in stock that is rapidly changing every single day, and government subsidies and all these other things that are actualizing the value of these companies consistently. His system, his world is that of personified capital. He is that. He is not $80 billion. He is derivative. He is that setup. He is all of these things. The capitalist as personified capital is the configuration of images produced by the point signs in the social space that we experience. Elon being, I think, that right now. Trump being that for boomers. And it's why I think the two of them working together did a number on a large number of people. As it says, as a function derived from the flux of capital, the worker as personified labor capacity. a function derived from the flux of labor. Same as capital, the worker is not just the shoemaker. No, because it's labor capacity. How much labor do you have the ability to do in what capacity and in what setup? If you haven't watched, there's a lot of YouTube's great videos on like the world's most dangerous jobs. Look up sulfur farmer and just mourn for humanity, I think would be the way I'd talk about it. But when we're talking about what they're doing and how they're doing it, the types of labor, how much they can be exploited, and how much that changes. Because again, the rate of change is what matters. The flux matters. So you'll hear me doing that for you new people who haven't been here. I don't say flow because they don't fucking say flow. It's a mistranslation. They say flux, and there's a reason they say flux. To continue. In this way, capitalism fills its field of eminence with images, even destitution, despair, and revolt. And on the other side, the violence and the oppression of capital. They become images of destitution, despair, revolt, violence, or oppression. It doesn't care. It's filling all of them with the images are fine. But starting from non-figurative figures or the breaks flux that produce them, these images will themselves be capable of figuring and reproducing only by shaping a human material whose specific form of reproduction falls outside the social field that nonetheless determines this form. This is the family. This is why this matters. This is why this matters. If you were socially determined, you would be coextensive with all of these things that are happening and formed by them, and they would be formed by you, which would make it very difficult. But instead, you get privatized. Our families do. We get raised outside of it. And that outside is kind of the big deal because these images are able to be digested, given to people and shaped. And now with that, it's not so much that we are coextensive, but instead that we are reproduced by images. As they will come to say, we are simulacra, the production of us, the way that the son is taught through images. The family teaches through images. Images become the way we see everything. This means that our understanding of things, the way our interests are formed, is not immanent to the social field, is not one with the social field, but instead is based on images. We're on page 264 of the English edition. You can also follow along by watching the stream, Shice. This is kind of the big deal. This is a big fucking deal. Because, again, when we talk about why men desire their own repression, if you saw my recent video on interest, it's a really important, specific thing to understand. We like to think that there is an interest socially because we like to pretend that we are one with the social field, but we're not. We are formed by families just outside of it that can be given images. These images can become us. We are the material these images are used to form. And that's the phrasing they use for this hyper materialism that they're talking about is so amazing. And that's the thing I love. It must be capable of figuring and reproducing only by shaping a human material whose specific form of reproduction falls outside the social field that nonetheless determines this form. Private persons are therefore images of the second order, images of images, that is, simulacra, that are thus endowed with an aptitude for representing the first order images of social persons. This is very important. How do I find myself calling myself a man, calling myself a woman, a Christian, a white man, a black man, whatever it is? Oh, it's through these images. I don't actually experience it directly. That's not how it works. I'm not that. I'm these things first. The human material is shaped by those images via the family, which then visits them socially. But we're simulacra now, interacting with simulacra, not socially determined, not directly, not like we used to be. Not like we used to be. Simulacra, thus endowed with an aptitude for representing the first order images of social persons, the capitalist, the laborer, the engineer, the whatever you may want to call it, these images, the first order, non-figurative, we get to represent. These private persons are formally delimited in the locus of the restricted family as father, mother, and child. But instead of being a strategy, actually, I'll go over that sentence because it is important. Formally delimited in the locus of the restricted family as father, mother, and child. These are the three ways that we call things in the family. That's it. You're free to think of another word that we use for these things that is not born of that triad. That this is the core image of these things that we are given. This is what we're placed as. I am father, my wife's mother, my son is child. Maybe son, maybe daughter. You're free to come up with other words for it. No one else will use those. No one else gives a shit. We are these things. We are these three elements. We are these three as socially and image determined, and that is using us as their material. Capital uses the family and the human as the material to reproduce these images through these three. That's the big deal. But instead of being a strategy that, through the action of alliances and filiations, opens onto the entire social field, is coextensive with it, and countersects its coordinates, as it did before, it would appear that the family is now merely a simple tactic around which the social field recloses, to which it applies its autonomous requirements of reproduction, that it counteracts with all its dimensions. The alliances and filiations no longer pass through people, but through money. So the family becomes a microcosm, suited to expressing what it no longer dominates. Big line. Big line. Big line. I think, isn't that you, Shakespeare? That's Shakespeare? It looks like Shakespeare. Makes me think of the title of Nabokov's book, King, Queen, and Knave. Yeah, actually, very much. And tell me that's not how families are seen. Tell me that's not how we discuss families. Shakespeare, good to have you. But it's this thing, the family becomes a microcosm, suited to expressing what it no longer dominates. This line is, again, a big deal, especially if you start looking back to how they've talked about the expression, how they talked about domination, how they talked about these elements. The family, at this point, expresses what it doesn't dominate. It expresses the images of the social world. It did dominate the social world, and the Earth Socialist flatly was coextensive with it. It would be silly to say otherwise. Kings and queens and their families ruled kingdoms. Family dominated the social sphere in that element. No, not so much in capital. Now, I know there's an outrage on the conservative side for the nuclear family, got to protect them, all that good stuff. Good for you guys. But it doesn't matter because it's not the thing. It's just not the thing. In a certain sense, the situation has not changed. For what is invested through the family is still the economic, political, and cultural social field. It breaks in flux. This is true. This is still through this. All these things are invested. Private persons are an illusion. Images of images are derivatives of derivatives. That's one side. But in another sense, everything has changed. Because the family, instead of constituting and developing the dominant factors of social reproduction, is content to apply and envelop these factors in its own mode of reproduction. Let's say a couple families, we have a big farm. There's no one else alive. Post-apocalypse, always fun to talk about the apocalypse. I'm a big Fallout fan. We have a handful of families, and the way that we will continue forward and the way that the social space is determined is through what all of us do and how we all interact. Like flatly, it's more emergent and determined through our actions. Now, it's also determining our actions. It's very direct. If we're going to have a field we're going to work in and literally cut up, we've got to do that. If we do that, it determines that we're not going to be, doing it a second time the next day. There is sort of in time, the social world as we carve into the ground builds around us. The things we've determined that are happening socially come visited back on us. And this happens through sort of the nature of time itself, through historical, political, and social sort of progress. Under capital, we don't have that same power. We don't have that same setup. The things that a family does don't really get written into the ground. Not really. because everything again is passing through capital. The only limits to what we can do are determined as such. An incredibly wealthy family can have as many fail sons as possible and still end up becoming president. But a family that works their ass off that happens to be an illegal immigrant, they can't. These things are not set up through emergent. They're not even set up through social norms. They're set up through images being revisited, where the family somehow has these images bred into them, these images built into them, and they then repeat. They become a facsimile of the image, a facsimile of a facsimile, a simulacra themselves. And as they sort of have their own modes of reproduction, and it's very difficult to break away from. I have 2 kids. It's been a really fascinating thing to see how much of this shit is really built in. But father, mother, and child become the simulacrum of the images of capital. Mr. Capital, Madam Earth, or Child the Worker. There is a king, queen, pauper mentality that just happens. When your kid wants something, are you going to give it to them? If you can. Well, what if they're disobedient? Well, what does disobedient fucking mean in this case? There's a lot of questions suddenly that, well, how do you punish? How do you think about these things? What do you want to teach? How do you do this? Well, the images of father, the images of mother, the images of these things, we reproduce. And we do it to a point that these images are no longer recognized at all in the desire that is determined to invest only their simulacrum. Desire is not invested in what you do. Desires invested in the simulacrum. The familial determinations become the application of the social axiomatic. Great last line that really, I think, touches into what they're getting at. Kind of want to move to the next paragraph, but I know we've got a bunch of stuff to talk about. I'll leave it open. Fuck it. Let's do it. I'll leave it open. It's a lot. Right. I know. It's a lot.
I actually don't even want to introduce anything new, but when reading a text, it's also important to sort of play at the dynamic as if it were clay or moldable. So when they're presenting the image of a family in the humanoid unit, the way that I try and digest this information is to ask myself, what would this word mean or look like if we were a different species? The closest thing that I can get to, obviously retaining the idea that we're equally as efficient or industrious, the closest species that I can get to would be either ants or bees, right? Where the socius is much more coherent as the hive, but there are particular subspecies of these animals that even when they have different hives, sometimes they get together and they don't act belligerently. They build their civilizations in a unified manner. Some of the hives have multiple queens, and what we see is that even from distant relation, they're able to distinguish each other spontaneously through the biomechanics of pheromones. But they seem to also create society and distinguishing cultures from among them.
I like that because in the next part, we're going to be talking about how each person is their own microcosm as well, that it's not just the family, that we are ourselves a multitude of mommy, daddy, me. And so when we talk about the bees or we talk about these setups, I actually think that's a really appropriate allegory to sort of be thinking about, because we're not talking about, and it's really important that we not think of, oh, mom and dad did this to me. No, mom and dad are also in themselves mom, dad, kid. And both of them are, and I am. And also within that, they are each mom, dad, kid. It's a tessellation of this triangulation that continually goes down. And so when we're talking about like the non-human, we're very much talking about the non-human mommy, daddy, me, and the images that desire's investing in, that it's investing in, and again, not human desire, it's a non-human desire. It's not our wants, but desire pulsing through that form of things. And whether it's bees or anything else, the images, the repeated images, the over and over repeated, oft repeated simulacra is what desire is pulsing through and coming back in. And whether it's ants, bees, moths, anything, you do actually see a lot of the same kind of behavior when, again, not mommy, daddy, me, but but the way that the collective deals with the sort of pulsing in and out and how they move in mass and how they move disjointedly. And again, within us, it's not drastically far off, because again, it's not that I am child in relation to my father and my mother. That is a triangulation, but I'm also father, mother to myself, also child to myself, and my father is child to himself and also father to himself. It starts getting fucked up because again, the thing that's being invested in is the simulacrum. It's not the actual family unit or the humans or your dad or my dad. It is the image of dad or father, I think I would say, if that makes sense. I always like your responses. Weird as shit. Makes my brain go in left, like take a left turn. I always like it. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt, Dublo. Go for it, Easton.
Your choice between flux and flow, because I do nerdy shit, I'm familiar with the difference, but I just wanted you to, I guess I wanted to ask, could you go a little deeper into why you chose that? Because it seems intuitive to me because I know the word, but I don't know.
Well, it's actually in French. In French, it's one of those things that like the first time I noticed it frustrated me. And then as I actually started to learn French, like 3 years ago, I started learning French just for this fucking book, actually. Just so I could read it and understand it. Well, it's when you don't have a lot else to do. Man, okay, so in French, they use two words for this. And one is rouler, which is water flowing from a faucet, right? Is couler. But then they also use flux, F-L-U-X. Now, flux is also used water from a faucet, but it's not used in the same way. You wouldn't say that the water flows from a faucet. You'd say, you would say it flows from a faucet unless, for example, the faucet explodes off. Then you'd say there's an explosion of water, a flux of water. You wouldn't say a flow of water. In Anti-Oedipus, in the French version, literally almost every time that flux is used in the English, if you go back and look, it's couler. And they very, very, I'm sorry, when you see flux is used, it's couler. And when you see flow, it's flux. They swapped them in English, like literally just flipped them around. And it's a few hundred instances where the word flux in the original is translated as flow, but they're meaning flux, bursting forward. It's fluidic dynamics, but it's a particular type. We'd think of it, and it's the grosser way, but it's orgasm. It's coming. Is like that's the way to think about it. It's the explosion. It's not the flow of it. You wouldn't say there's a flow of semen. It's like, well, that's, I mean, maybe in porn or some anime, but it's like, it's an explosion. It's a burst. It's afflux. It's acid reflux. It's vomiting. It's a flux of breast milk. It doesn't flow out of the breast. That's not how breast milk works. These things burst. And the other half of it that's really, really important is the reason they use flux comes from two places. One is Henri Bergson, who flux is like the core of everything for him, because when we talk about becoming, it's not the steady streams of flows. That would imply a steadiness, which is fucking broken as a thing. Instead, it's a flux, specifically like power, like energy. So it's a rate of change. And that's why flux is used for this sort of discussion. When we talk about electricity and the rate of change, we talk about the flux of the signal, not necessarily what the signal is, because the rate of change matters. Why does this matter?
Exactly.
Because everything in capitalism is based on the derivative and the rate of change. Capital doesn't have a value. It's one of the big, deep critiques that I think they don't necessarily critique Marx directly, but I think they critique a lot of people who come after Marx, who talk about capital as being sort of money, when in fact they're talking very cleanly the Suzanne de Brunoff sense, where you have capital and then you have money. Money is the payment you and I get. I get $50. I have $50. It's worth $50 when I go spend it. But when you have $50 billion, that's not worth $50 billion. That's not how it works. Instead, it's worth whatever you can get for it based on various rates of change and how it's being used in marketplaces and what it will do. If you go to a horse track, this is the easiest way to sort of talk about it. If I go to a horse track and I bet $100,000 on the favorite to win or a long shot, I've completely fucked the odds up. My rate of return on that is going to be significantly different than if I had $50 that I put on the same bet. This is because by touching the system, you've affected it. The rate of change of things is what capital cares about, the actual concretization. And if we step away from that to these ideas of flows, it one, fucks up the entire understanding of the book, in my opinion. But even worse, it gives people this idea that like Deleuze and Guattari are into like free-flowing, free connections and free thought and like, oh, just allow anything to happen. And that's not it at all. That couldn't be further from anything that they wrote in any single way whatsoever. So it makes it really tough in English. So I'm kind of an ass about it. Trust me, I'm on the verge of not saying schizophrenic anymore, by the way, either.
Well, I don't know if I would abandon that one, but I'm a wee baby at this. Like anyway, the that you went to the magnetic metaphor, huge thing, and it reminds me that that joke. If you owe the bank $100, the bank owns you, but if you owe the bank $100 million, you own the bank.
Yeah,
it's that idea that like you're never going to get that back in 2 installments. There's a flux to it.
Mm-hmm. It's a rate of change. It's a shifting. And when we talk about it, the need for us to understand the derivative and how these things connect, because again, calculus is core to how Deleuze not only sees this, but how meaning is made. Here we're talking about, for example, at the very end here, he mentions the social axiomatic. All of this is based on set theory at a base level. And the axiomatic nature of set theory is the combining or the relationship of mathematical sets to each other, which means the derivative thereof. And this is where we start getting into how he talked about sets in Logic of Sense, how he talked about the resonances of them, and how in What is Philosophy and Others, he will continue to sort of grow this as he really goes nuts talking about the diagrammatic and other things. So it's really important to not, to me, I believe it's very important for us not to necessarily go into this place of like free flow, but instead understand he's actually being really particular and actually like really hyperlogical and mathematical here, even though it sounds like, from the language they use, sounds like a crazy person rambling at length. He's actually very exacting and very much touching into a lot of fields that I think people don't understand.
One thing I wanted to sort of add to this is that just because like since you're talking about the usage of the word flux, right, as a kind of I mean, like you had compared it to like ejaculation, right? And that immediately made me think of jouissance, right? Because of the fact that its origin is jouir, which means the same thing, to ejaculate. And from it we get like the word joystick. It comes from jouissance, like that's why it's a joystick, so to speak. But another aspect too is that, if I may just relate it quickly to epistemology of the closet, I think it's very interesting because Sedgwick also, when talking about like the idea of the regime of keeping secret, right, and how one communicates this, she very particularly says it happens in fits and starts, right? Mm-hmm. It's through those. It's not a constant. It's not a flow. It's a flux, as it's you're never able to like open the door of the closet, so to speak, and it be constant being out constantly, so to speak. Instead, it's fits and starts that sort of begin that process. So I don't know, I find that fascinating that there is this kind of connection both in a more epistemological social sense, but also in the mathematical sense, as you were kind of mentioning.
Well, and it's that actual sentence in fits and starts is actually in the first sentence of AO, talking about desire. It functions everywhere, sometimes without stopping, sometimes in fits and starts. Literally the opening of the English version, I believe they use the term discontinuous. God damn it, I can't remember the exact wording, but it is implying the same thing. And yes, they're taking a lot of inspiration from there for sure.
Okay.
So yeah, yes, this desire. One of the things that they really, really are rallying against is when we talk about desire. It's very common for people to talk about it as though flows. The jouissance from a lot of Lacan's work, clearly through Guattari, comes back around to this because the way that they talk about desire is that of bursts of connection and then breaking. It isn't a continuous sort of karmic process. It's that like the new agey hippy dippy bullshit, woo garbage, but instead like, no, it's fits and starts and constantly building and breaking, but it's doing it really fast. And that's why they use the term flux, because then we can start talking about it in terms of oscillation rather than process, because oscillation is the way to consider this. It's the vibrations, the resonances, the way that these things operate is at that speed. It's not really at word speed, you might say.
Yeah, you are correct to draw the distinction between flux and flow. The way that I see it as a linguist is that when you're talking, the aperture of the mouth has to interrupt the flow of air in order for particular phonemes to be expressed. And
yes.
Initially the vowel sounds are flows, but then in between them you create consonants, which is the stoppage of air, and thus it creates flux.
Well, and also the intonation and the setup of everything is about varying the vibration or the oscillation of said stoppage of air via the vocal cords. These things are constant breaking of little tiny miniature millisecond, billisecond, fucking nanosecond connections. This setup puts us in a very different type of thing than I think a lot of people, and this includes the Mark Fishers and the Nick Lands, who very much have this sort of whole body understanding of desire instead of sort of taking it as this consistent resonance. I think it's a lot more interesting, at least, certainly. But again, it's literally the text, and I'm not usually that much of a narc when it comes to like wording, but when you're talking about someone who like they spent so much time on this book trying to think through exactly how to word things because they were coming up with concepts that people needed to understand and they wanted to discuss, and then to completely do them dirty like that, I think is wild. Like they spent a time being particular for a fucking reason.
Yeah, and another thing too, sort of like with that idea of like the speech act, right, or how you have these interruptions which are somehow intelligible to other people, right? Is that actually is something that particularly in the late Middle Ages and the early modern period, so like the 16th and the 15th century, really, I mean, but even going back to ancient times, really, really bothered people, right? This idea that like the voice was somehow this thing that wasn't connected to anything else, right? It's just air. And so then you have, this dislocation, and that's where you get like the idea of like a stomach talker, right? A ventriloquist, right? Like that's literally what that means. And so it's this very interesting, like, sort of fear that comes out that, right? The idea that when you're speaking, it's sort of something besides yourself, right? It's not actually you, and that's why like a lot of the like horror tropes involve some other voice speaking instead of what your voice is, right? And so I don't know, I find that quite fascinating too, to connect it with the action itself, right? Is that there's also this anxiety about the action of speaking as well too.
It's
to Dublo's point. Sorry. Okay.
No, go,
to
Dublo's
point and to yours as well. Your name's not popping up on here again because my phone's being Shakespeare. It like resonates with my experience as being an Anglophone who decided to learn Korean because it was re-engineering the entire virtual space of all the phonetics that I had come to take for granted. And it's, it goes back to like Chomskyan language, this idea that, what you hear is the sounds you make, and the closer you get, of course you get rewarded. But that your conception of phony, or your conception of phonetics, is what guides the development of speech to that, and to create that virtual topology of phonetics. And I had to completely deconstruct it and develop an entirely different ontology of like the I guess different phenomenology of like, what does it feel like to say things correctly in Korean, and like impress that on my unconscious to the point where I could just frontal lobe that shit, or it's like beyond the frontal lobe and I can just push it out. I can just do it. I don't think about it. Whereas I used to have to mechanically differentiate and like conceptualize the feeling of making like plosives and fricatives and all those things that would probably make more sense to someone who would consider themselves more of a linguist. I'm just a linguistics nerd who, you know, has about 3 languages. 2 of them are dying on the vine, but absolutely fascinating and incredibly applicable even at those like goofy little hobby levels. Just fascinating.
If you get a chance, I upload. I just
tossed
tossed real quick. I just
okay, yeah.
All right, go for it, Dublo. You go for it. I'll finish the point off.
Well, the thing is that I wonder if that I know the phenomenon you're talking about, and I really do wonder if bees and ants have that same sort of dialect going on, where like in the story that's told in the Bible, I can't remember the exact chapter, where they were able to tell that this person was from a different city based on how he said a particular word, right? And so I would suspect that, yeah, bees and ants have the same sort of dialectal identity that is very stringently coherent to their sulcus, to their family, to their hive.
They've done studies on bees' dances and how they don't necessarily translate in the same way that we would say that, you know, there's a universal bee dance or anything like that. I'll find that. I was reading through this. We went through this like 2.5 years ago. I think someone else brought bees. I put in the chat because Easton, if you're into the linguistics thing and you haven't read the Yelmslev, oh my God. Yelmslev is very much next level, and I think pretty extraordinary in the way that he breaks down kind of everything, and the semiotics that we've discussed. And I know you weren't here for that part of it, but the semiotics of Deleuze and Guattari both are straight out of Yelmslev, and his work is amazing.
Dope as hell. Thank you so much.
I paused 3 PDFs in there. His books, Language and Introduction, his book, there's a guide on glossomatics I included, and then another one on Deleuze's reading of Yelmslev. And it's, it'll further break down. It's, I don't want to say there's nothing more to break down, because there's always going to be something more, but there's a level where it's like, holy shit, I didn't even consider. Jan Yelmslev is just confusingly wonderful. Like, it's the kind of thing, like, if you're a linguist, you'll enjoy the rest of your life, because that will be it. But with that, good convo, very good. Back to this, though, talking about family, for example, talking about the familial determinations in the social axiomatic. This shift is the big one, and I think we actually have covered it pretty nicely here, but it's the push from the idea that the family is coextensive to now determined socially, that by these images, the familial determinations become the application of a social axiomatic, the application of it. And that's very, very important when we start talking about these things, the terminology they've got here. But to continue to the next little bit here, the family becomes the sub-aggregate to which the whole of the social field is applied. Since each person has his own private father and mother, it is a distributive sub-aggregate that simulates for each person the collective whole of social persons, that closes off his domain and scrambles his images. Everything is reduced to the father-mother-child triangle, which reverberates the answer, daddy-mommy, every time it is stimulated by the images of capital. In short, Oedipus arrives. It is born in the capitalist system of the application of first-order social images to the private familial images of the second order. It is the aggregate of destination that corresponds to an aggregate of departure that is socially determined. It is our intimate colonial formation that corresponds to the form of social sovereignty. We are all little colonies, and it is Oedipus that colonizes us. When the family ceases to be a unit of production and of reproduction, when the conjunction again finds in the family the meaning of a simple unit of consumption, it is father-mother that we consume. In the aggregate of departure, there is the boss, the foreman, the priest, the tax collector, the cop, the soldier, the worker, all the machines and territorialities, all the social images of our society. But in the aggregate of destination, in the end, there is no longer anyone but daddy, mommy, and me. The despotic sign inherited by daddy, the residual territoriality assumed by mommy, and the divided, split, castrated ego. Isn't this operation of flattening, folding, of application, what leads Lacan to say, willingly betraying the secret of psychoanalysis as an applied axiomatic, what appears to, quote, come most freely into play in what is called the analytic dialogue, in fact, depends on a sub-foundation that is perfectly reducible to a few essential and formalizable articulations, end quote. Everything is preformed, arranged in advance. The social field where everyone acts and is acted upon as a collective agent of enunciation, an agent of production and anti-production, is reduced to Oedipus, where everyone now finds himself cornered and cut along the line that divides him into an individual subject of the statement and the individual subject of enunciation. The subject of the statement is the social person, the subject of enunciation, the private person. So it's your father, so it's your mother, so it's you. The familial conjunction results from the capitalist conjunctions, insofar as they are applied to private persons. Daddy, mommy, me, one is sure to re-encounter them everywhere, since everything has been applied to them. The reign of images is the new way in which capitalism utilizes the schizzes, diverts the flux, composite images, images flattened onto other images, so that when this operation reaches its outcome, the little ego of each person, related to its father-mother, is truly the center of the world. Much more underhanded than the subterranean reign of the fetishes of the earth or the celestial reign of the despot's idols is the advent of the Oedipal narcissistic machine. Quote, no more glyphs and hieroglyphs will have the real objective reality, our Kodak vision. To every man, to every woman, the universe is just a setting to the absolute little picture of himself, herself. A picture, a Kodak snap, in a universal film of snaps. Quote, each person as the little triangulated microcosm. The narcissistic ego is identical with the Oedipal subject. I really, really, really love this shit, by the way. This is good stuff. A Kodak snap is a photo, what you kids would call a selfie, just for the children who are listening. By children, I mean anyone under 30. All right. There's so much said here. Let's talk about, go a little bit back. Let's talk about Euclidean geometry. Euclidean geometry is a way of seeing the world in which things are measured and defined before you do a thing. For example, what is a circle? A circle is a single point surrounded by an infinite number of points that are equidistant from primary point. That's what a circle is. Now, that's how you determine if something's a circle. That is what a circle is. But I can also tell you that I made a circle by, a circle is when you have a piece of string and you go like this and you draw like that. Makes a circle. They're both true. They're both accurate. It's not like one is not. But there's a way to think about circles that one allows and the other doesn't. Circles are a thing, or circles are made a thing. It's a minor qualm, isn't it? But it's kind of the center to what we're talking about here. When a family exists only as a subaggregate of the social world, all of its images pouring through into this family, you then fit into those images. You fit into a circle or a square or anything else. This is what a boss is. This is what a blank does. One of my favorite examples of this that happened in the real world, and it's an ideal exact example. I've had a hell of a work career. I was vice president for James Cameron's production company. It's not a small thing. I was there for 4.5 years. And my dad and mom came out to visit, and we were in the car, and I was still on a phone call in a meeting, and we were driving, and I swore a lot. I swear a lot in meetings. My dad turned to me and he says, Brooks, vice presidents do not talk like that. That's it. That's the difference. Because I turned to him and I said, apparently they do. So that's the image. That's the circle versus the circle. What is a capitalist? What is a laborer? What is mom? What is dad? Those images become us. We become them. They filter into the family. They become everything reduced to them, and everything reduced to a combination of them. The image becomes the structure. This is incredibly important to understanding the book, and this is the basis for why Oedipus is an issue, why family is an issue, and why they're talking about Oedipus as a complex. They are not saying, as they have said before, they're not saying there is no one who would ever have the Oedipus complex. There probably have been men or women who've had sexual feelings for their opposite or same-sex parent and wanted to kill the other one. The Oedipus complex, that configuration probably has existed. But that configuration isn't what a human is. The circle is those things, if you would define it like that. But that isn't what a circle has to be. Circle is made a certain way. We build life. We emergently build forward, or we have images that we fit within. And the images aren't complete. They're not total. When the family ceases to be a unit of production and reproduction, as it was in the despotic, as it was in the earth socius, when the conjunction again finds in the family the meaning of a simple unit of consumption, it is father, mother we consume. In the aggregate of departure, there is the boss, the foreman, the priest, the tax collector, the cop, the soldier, the worker. There's an infinite number of things out there that's fine. It's all of these, all the machines, all the territorialities, all the social images of our society. But in the aggregate of destination, in the end, there is no longer anyone but daddy, mommy, me. The despotic sign inherited by daddy, the residual territory assumed by mommy, and the divided, split, castrated ego. This operation of flattening, folding of application is what leads Lacan to say everything can be broken down to these formalizable articulations, which is a very, very Euclidean circle way of looking at things. Everything becomes preformed, arranged in advance. No, Mark Fisher, fuck, I hate him. Hey, the idea that, oh God, there's no more new music, everything is just derivative. It's because you've created circles that already encircle those things. It's just silly to say that's the thing. We've arranged these things in advance. We've arranged these images in advance. We've been Oedipalized by being placed into this triangulation, by having the images visited upon us, and then us recreating those images in the world as we move out, everything being preformed with us as the material. It isn't the conditions, the material conditions that form us. We are the material that material conditions are working with. It's one of the real big misunderstandings of a lot of leftists is they're like, oh, humans are like, we're cool. We're unique and special and amazing. And the material conditions produce specific. No, we are the material that conditions are producing. We are the things formed. We are the elements images are building. We are this thing. The subject of the statement is the social person. The subject of enunciation, the private person. This is the subject of the statement, the social person. Subject of enunciation, the private person. If I speak about a dude, social person. If I speak about a dude, it's me. It's a private person. It's your father, mother, it's you. A familial conjunction results from capitalist conjunctions. the capitalist conjunctions, the meaning machine, the images produced by capitalism as these things collide together and produce, they're applied to private persons. What is Brooks? What are you? What are you going to be? How are you going to be? What is the YouTuber in you going to be? What are you watching? What are you looking at? All of these things, these images are produced through the conjunctions that are happening socially and then visited upon you through not just your parents, also through you and also in you. That's the way it works. You're doing that thing because you need to encounter them everywhere because everything has been applied to them. Everything becomes mommy daddy. Even if it's two daddies, one playing daddy, one playing mommy. It's a horrifying reality. I think what you end up seeing is we don't have a lot of daddy. Despite having gay marriage and adoption of kids, there's a feminine dad or a masculine mom. These things and these relationships we reproduce. The images are within all of us. We are invested in the images, in the simulacra of them. We put ourselves in them. The reign of images is the new way in which capitalism utilizes the skiz and diverts the flux. The composite images flattened onto others so that when this operation reaches its outcome, the little ego of each person related to father, mother is the center of the world. You tell me that's not a fucking great way to talk about everyone. You tell me that. What about non-binary persons? I have NB friends who are married to non-NBs. I have a lot of unique. There is, and it's easy to see once they have kids. Doesn't exist as much in the one-on-one relationships. Have a kid. Fucks you up. You don't realize how much of that shit is built into you. It'll ruin your day. But when you have a kid, the stuff that is so deep in you that your parents did to you that you don't even realize. My son, he was like 3 or 4. I think he was 4. I cook all the meals. I cook a big dinner. And I sat down and he took a bite and he was like, I want a milkshake. And I said to him, not unless you clean off your plate. And I look immediately at my wife. I go, why the fuck did I say that? I tell this story a lot because it fucks with me that I said this because I don't fucking have I don't believe in that shit. Apparently I do, but I don't cognizantly consider this a thing. When you're a parent, you will find in you shit coming out that is not an intellectualization, that is not how you perceive yourself or how you want to be perceived or how you've carved or built an image or what you think. You will find really where your desire pathways sit. And for everyone, I'm trying to think, there's probably an exception. I shouldn't say that, but I have NB friends who have kids. There's a mom and a dad. And I don't mean to gender them. They behave a certain way. And it's actually usually the opposite of what you may think in almost every case. But there is someone who makes the rules and someone who's a little bit softer on it. And that weird interaction is it's a strange thing. And we laugh about it because this is kind of how this works. This is the images that are built in that we are invested in. Oh, so you're the father, you're the mother, you're playing this role, and it can be distributed either way in various conditions, in various ways. It's fucking wild. But this images, this setup that creates this unique ego that is able to look out into the world. That's kind of the big deal. It's kind of the big, huge deal because it's this narcissistic thing that the universe revolves around and is for. Everything becomes about you. It's also how we raise our kids, sadly. And it's very tough to do otherwise. Very tough. We can have that discussion some other time. It's tiring. But it's what they're talking about here. The setup, as they're saying, it's the advent of the Oedipal narcissistic machine beats the despotic entirely. It beats everything because everything becomes about you, your images, how you're putting them together. I did a piece on the substance that I think goes through this very, very nicely. When you see an advertisement, we talk about advertising as though they're doing a thing. When they make an advertisement, they're doing a thing for people. There's social person there, and then there's the enunciation, which is the private person. They're doing it for you. When you look at it, how you look at it, if you are attracted to it, you build that image to being about you. Oh, I find that repulsive. I have no interest in that product. Doesn't matter. You're relating it to you. You're building everything out of you. It doesn't matter anymore because you have the subjective reality, all these images, the Kodak vision. To every man, to every woman, the universe is a setting to take the absolute little picture of himself, a picture, a snap in a universal film of snaps. This triangulated little microcosm, the narcissistic ego, identical with the Oedipal subject. And that's it. This is where we are. This is where we sit. It's, if you ever get a chance, I'm not saying everyone has to have kids. I encourage everyone to spend time around very little children, infants, if possible. If you have a chance to be around them a lot, I have kids. It's fun. It's an interesting time if you want to. You will be terrified with how they come out. I love Ms. Dixon is exactly the same. I've been shocked by the shit that has come out of my mouth, and my therapist has helped a great deal because it's shit you don't even realize that sits inside of you. I think I talked the last couple weeks about my daughter, and my wife pointed out, do you know that you're more gentle with Violet? And I didn't know. Like with Dexter, since he was little, I was like really athletically involved with him, and I just did this because I'm a gregarious giant person. With Violet, I'm more gentle, and that I didn't realize, and it's fucked up. Like she's laughing because she knows I don't believe in gender, but it's like these things are built in really weird ways, and this is again that non-personal reality of how desire is invested and how it's building out. We intellectualize, we rationalize however we do, but the images of what we are, how we are, these images, the simulacra that desire is invested in, this is the Oedipal subject that is all of us. Every single one of you too, by the way. It doesn't really matter. And it's and someone on YouTube's like, it's a W for my wife. Yeah, it is. We call each other out a lot because we both have had interesting lives. But it's a really fascinating thing. And you'll see there's wonderful studies that are being done now on parents who are sort of going through this. But again, NB parents, gay couples, if you watch any of the there's reality shows about having multiple parents. There's a dad, or in a role there is a dad or a mom. Fucking weird shit. It's weird. Humans are wild. Humans are a wild thing. Very wild thing. I'll finish my ramble there. I want to get to the next paragraph before the end of the day, so we'll get there. But I want to open it up to everyone. Josh, as I see you unmuted.
Yes. The question arises, is your differential behavior towards your daughter as compared to your son the result of a way in which you were shaped, or were you responding to differences in the behavior of your daughter as opposed to your son? And the reason I raise that, I want to raise that in conjunction with the whole way that Deleuze and Guattari shape and compose their critique of Oedipus. Because I want to suggest that they do it in such a way that they're not getting rid of Oedipus. Well, and I'm sure you would agree with that. They're not getting rid of it. But they maintain the body or the architecture of Oedipus, but they're making it something that fits within a dynamic which is transformative. It's transformative on the basis of the virtual dimension that makes history transformative. It makes social relations transformative. But within the bounds of particular social formations, you do have what functions in the way that Oedipus for Freud functions, and that is that they determine in a certain direction, in a fascizing direction.
Mm-hmm.
And so, but and the reason that I began that, with that question concerning, a different way to look at the, your actions towards your daughter was that putting it in terms of of a certain immediate responsiveness can that potentially could be used as a critique. That is to say that there could be that responsive interactions or relations within social structures. There's a way in which you can raise that as a question and direct it.
Oh, there's no causative beginning to it. So to say cleanly, I don't know. Like, I'm just going to be the answer is, I don't know if it's her responses or mine. Given, and again, it's a personal thing that I kind of went through, but it's like when I started to actually do it, how I felt uncomfortable made it clear that it's much more me, because she thought it was the best thing ever. And it turns out she thinks it's the best thing ever. So, but I felt uncomfortable, and like, I felt repulsed by the idea, not like repulsed is probably the wrong word, but I felt discouraging myself from doing this, but it wasn't the case. She thought it was hilarious. She was into it. She's not weak. She's not any of those things. I was worried. I was nervous. And but is it like, where do these interplays come from? How do they go? There's a point where, and this is one of the great challenges, we know as a society that we do treat the littlest of people very particularly, with boys. And I can tell you, having raised kids and seen how people in public treat them, boys and girls are treated drastically different. And there's that thing happens from basically birth on. And it's a really fascinating question of how much of that and her responses then shaped me to not be, and how much Dexter, who was kind of a psychotic little physical nightmare, like literally there was a month where he didn't walk. He hopped everywhere saying the word hop, not joking. He weird, hyperactive, but at the same time, is that because of X, Y, or Z? And this is the stuff that when we talk about the material conditions that produce people or that we're involved with, what place do you want to have with it? Where do you want to sit? We'll get to chapter 4, where they start talking about things you can start doing. And again, I started just dealing with it in generalized therapy and in meditation and some personal work. But we are the material being formed. All of it, all of us. There is no person who's free of this. There's no one who's existed above this. This isn't a thing. It's a weird sort of Christian soul-based, ascetic view of displacement. The reality is we're all produced. Images are part of that production, and they fall back on us, and we end up utilizing them and becoming invested in them. How we do that and where it sits and everything is, I think, one of the lifelong journey questions. And I'm with you on that completely. And again, I'm not saying that this is the answer for everyone. Everyone's going to be different. This is how I've been discovering, but I still think it's a good example of, like, I don't personally, as I speak about these things, I am not a person who really gets into gender as a thing. Not really. And to have such a disparate way that I've treated my kids, I found fascinating. And again, it's because of these images and setups. It was in response also to a question that I think is related. A friend of mine who's an MB with a dude as the husband. They're not the wife. It's NB. Everyone's unique. It's so fascinating. I find it fascinating. But she's his mom, totally momming it up, just flatly, but also dadding it up. And the husband's kind of momming it up. And it depends on the situation. And it's like, it's so fascinating to watch. But what you don't see, and I think the part that, and we laugh about it because it's how we're raised, and they both grew up in really more traditional family homes. There isn't a time where both are the relaxed mom, or they're both the relaxed or the law-giving dad or the advice-giving person. It's really difficult to actually do both of those things at the same time. And so this is where you get into, I think, the really interesting question of this, which is, what does a non-Oedipal family look like? This is a fun discussion we've had and we will have again. But yeah, no, Josh, sorry for the ramble, but like, yeah, this is the interesting shit as far as I'm concerned, is that question. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah. And it's also striking. Think about my I don't have kids, but my brother, continually recounts to me how so much of his child rearing is based on a reaction against his memories of how his parents our parents raised him, and the questions he asked starting when he was a kid. Why is it necessary for them to, like what the story you recounted about, you can't have dessert until you finish your beans or whatever,
Yep.
those kinds of things. Where even as kids, it occurred to us, what was the sense behind that? But then we remember that, we carry it forward. And in my brother's case, say so much of my child rearing was specifically an attempt not to repeat what my parents did. Now, did he revert in some cases? Yeah, he would admit he did. But at the same time, I mean, his children, my niece and nephew, are so dramatically different than we were in many respects, precisely as a result of the different decisions my brother was able to make as a parent. And so that's interesting that, from a Deleuzian perspective, in terms of where, how to determine where that change in behavior comes from, or how to analyze that from a perspective which isn't slipping into, well, I don't know. I mean,
Well, I mean, this is the point. It's exactly what you're saying. This is the fascinating part. And I think, again, the idea that capitalism is pure evil is a silly thing. The way that society and social worlds interact and how they interplay comes with a lot of different moving parts. And one of the things that's really interesting is that capitalism, by breaking down these old codes, for example, the idea of woman, man, in that sense, in how they related socially in those particular ways, the way that a son would be relegated to the father's work because that's how social codes operated. These things being obliterated is nothing but good. It frees desire. It's emancipatory. We're finally, I think, at that point where we can start asking some of these questions, because we're starting to see the same breakdown of the parental structure and these types of things that I think are really fascinating to how do we do it? How do we think about, how do we have these discussions in a way that enables us to move forward and figure out kind of what is that next step? Because everything's falling apart, not just politically and everything in America, but I mean, like, everything's in this process. How do we think about or talk about what it means to be a parent in that sense? And I think it's spot on. Yeah, Silas, it's the transition to socialism, but messier. It's going to be a hell of a ride, this transition, if Marx is right. What's up, Estelle?
Oh, well, I've thought a while about families, how you have those weird things of property relations that kind of we kind of have a property relationship to our children, so that, like, there's a responsibility. And
they're my kids, right?
Yeah, and I'm kind of repulsed by that. I don't personally. I don't want people to belong to me, even kids who I care about very much. So like, thinking about how that works, how I want to make things better for people or for myself, it's hard to think about.
It's very hard. It's incredibly difficult, because it's hard. One, it's hard because this is the language we use, and then not to be like not to say that it's the necessary language, but you know, when you are a parent, you got kids, there's no way to be like, hey, there are children I keep in my house who would like to play with your children. Like it doesn't work quite the same way as saying, hey, my kids are about the same age as your kids. I keep children in my house who are the same age as yours. Doesn't have the same ring. So when we start like having the conversation about how do we talk about it, how do we set up, how do we create the way or the structure for this to be communicated, again, we will get to that because they actually have some really interesting answers in this. But it is very much that kind of question of like, how do we have a social conversation with people who are, because we are socially determined, but we're being determined by the images of the social world, not directly by the social world itself. We're not coextensive. It's a very, very different beast. And it is, it's really hard, and not to harp too much on the world of being a parent. One of the hardest things is to have your kid run around at a playground. It sounds stupid, but you will hear other parents' kids, to use the ownership terminology, say really weird, awful shit that like you then have to re-explain to your kids about how, why wouldn't they let Violet come play? They said she was a girl. Girls aren't allowed to do that. It's like, fucking, what the fuck? Like, she's 2, guys. What the fuck? Like, come on. So it's really, it becomes the social space and the collisions of that become very difficult. We hit 2 hours. I'm going to, usually I go a little bit over today. I've got a hard stop. I hate to do that. This has been absolutely lovely. And Estelle, thank you for the comments. Same with Josh's, Easton, Dublo, and everyone else who commented, whether in chat or otherwise. Thank you all. I'm going to be streaming a little bit later this week. We'll go back over this. It'll be an evening stream, maybe early morning for the Europeans, because I know I get hit a lot about doing late night streams by the Euros. They hate that. And I feel like I want to go over a little bit more of the family stuff. There's some really interesting shit in here, and some secondary sort of text that I think would be worth bringing in. So I'll do a stream sort of talking about that. That'll be fun. But otherwise, thank you all for watching. Thank you all for joining. This has been lovely, and it always, always is. Please, if you're on YouTube, like, subscribe, all that fun, dumb, whatever bullshit, who cares? Please join the Discord. Above all, discord.gg/DGQC. Join the conversation. Become part of what we're doing. We're trying to build something interesting. And the more of you, the better. So thank you all.
Thanks.
And we'll see you next week.